The Mount Valley Women's Correctional Facility stood on the outskirts of Milford, Ohio, like a gray monument to human error. The 3-story, dark brick building was surrounded by high fences topped with barbed wire, and 4 guard towers reminded everyone that this place was for those who had broken the law. On that rainy Tuesday in October 2024, a prison bus pulled up to the main gate. 3 women in orange jumpsuits got out, escorted by 2 guards. Among them was Jody Mitchell, a 28-year-old woman of average height with chestnut hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Her brown eyes looked at the world with the weariness of someone who had lost too much. Jody had been sentenced to 2 years for credit card fraud, a crime she had committed not out of greed but out of desperation. Her 6-year-old son, Michael, had leukemia, and insurance only covered part of the treatment. When the money ran out, Jody resorted to what she had previously considered unthinkable. Now Michael was living with her mother in Akron, and Jody was facing 2 years behind bars. "Welcome to Mount Valley," said Sergeant Patricia Rodriguez, a 45-year-old woman with military bearing and a stern gaze. She had been working in the correctional system for 15 years and had seen hundreds of women like these. "This is your home for the foreseeable future. Follow me." Jody and the other newcomers passed through a series of metal doors, each of which closed behind them with a hollow clang. The corridors smelled of disinfectant and something vaguely sour. The walls were painted a dull green, and fluorescent lights cast a cold, lifeless glow. The first stop was the intake office. Here, Jody handed over her personal belongings, her late husband's wedding ring, a photo of Michael, and an old wristwatch. Each item was carefully recorded and packed into a clear plastic bag. "This will be returned to you upon your release," explained the clerk, a young woman named Betty who was clearly new to the job. Her hands trembled slightly as she filled out the paperwork. After a medical examination conducted by Dr. James Reeder, a man in his 50s with graying temples and kind but tired eyes, Jody was given a prison uniform and a number, 247891. Dr. Reeder had been working at Mount Valley for 8 years and had an impeccable reputation. The inmates trusted him, and the administration valued his professionalism. "Do you have any chronic illnesses?" Dr. Reeder asked, looking over Jody's medical chart. "No," she replied quietly. "But my son has leukemia." The doctor looked up from his papers. There was understanding in his eyes. "That's tough. Does your mother take care of him?" Jody nodded, not trusting her voice. Talking about Michael was always difficult for her. The next step was a meeting with the social worker, Miss Carol Washington, an energetic woman in her 40s who sincerely believed in rehabilitation. Her office was different from the other rooms in the prison, with motivational posters on the walls and fresh flowers on the desk. "Jody, I know everything seems hopeless right now," said Ms. Washington, opening a file. "But Mount Valley offers a variety of programs. We have job training courses, educational programs, support groups." "I'm only interested in one thing," Jody replied. "When can I see my son?" "Visits are on Saturdays. The first visit is possible 1 month after arrival, provided you behave well." 1 month. 30 days without Michael seemed like an eternity. Finally, Jody was escorted to Block B, where she would spend the next 2 years. The block was a long corridor with cells on both sides. Each cell was designed for 2 people and contained a bunk bed, a small table, a stool, and a metal toilet with a sink. Jody's neighbor was Rita Moreno, a 40-year-old Latina serving time for drug trafficking. Rita had been there for 3 years and knew all the prison rules, written and unwritten. "The first rule," Rita said, watching Jody unpack her few belongings, "is to stay out of trouble. The second rule is to never trust anyone completely. And the third is that the authorities here are not your friends, no matter what they say." Jody listened intently. In her former life, as a nurse in a small hospital, a wife and a mother, she had never thought she would need such knowledge. "What's the warden like?" Jody asked. "Hamilton?" Rita paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's special. He tries to appear fair, but he has his favorites. Just keep a low profile and you'll be fine." That same day, Jody saw Carl Hamilton for the first time. He was 45 years old and had been in charge of Mount Valley for the past 7 years. Hamilton was an imposing man, about 6 feet tall, with short hair and piercing gray eyes. He wore an immaculately pressed uniform and always carried himself with the dignity of a man accustomed to power. Hamilton made his weekly rounds of the blocks, a tradition he had introduced when he first started working at Mount Valley. He believed that a boss should know his charges by sight and be aware of what was going on. "New girl," he said, stopping at Jody's cell. His voice was deep and calm. "Mitchell, right?" "Yes, sir," Jody replied, getting up from the bed. Hamilton studied her for a few seconds. Something about this woman caught his attention. Perhaps the way she carried herself, or the sadness in her eyes, which was different from the usual prison hardness. "I hope you settle in quickly," he said. "We're a good facility. We believe in second chances for those who are willing to earn them." "Thank you, sir." Hamilton nodded and continued on his rounds. But something made him look back twice at cell number 247. Carl Hamilton lived in a large house in the suburbs of Milford with his wife Margaret and 2 teenage children. Margaret worked as a teacher at a local school, and the children were in their senior years of high school. On the surface, they were the perfect middle-class American family. But beneath the veneer of prosperity, cracks were beginning to show. Carl and Margaret's marriage had long been a formality. They slept in separate bedrooms, hardly spoke except to discuss practical matters, and stayed together only for the sake of their children and public appearances. Carl spent more and more time at work, finding in prison the sense of control and power he lacked at home. In Mount Valley, Carl was an unquestioned authority. His decisions were never questioned, and his word was law. This power gradually changed him, making him more cynical and prone to abuse. Jody's first days in prison were spent trying to adjust to his new reality. Wake up at 6 in the morning, breakfast in the dining hall, work in the prison laundry, lunch, an hour of yard time, dinner, and lights out at 10 at night. Every day was identical to the one before, and this monotony was as oppressive as the fact of imprisonment itself. Jody quickly understood the prison hierarchy. There were those who were in charge, mostly women serving long sentences for serious crimes. There were those who were just trying to survive. And there were the outcasts, usually women convicted of crimes against children or who had cooperated with law enforcement. Fortunately, Jody fell into the category of those who were just trying to survive. Her crime, credit card fraud to pay for her child's medical treatment, elicited sympathy rather than contempt. The laundry work was hard and monotonous, but Jody was grateful for the opportunity to keep busy. The 8-hour shifts helped take her mind off Michael and how long the time in prison was dragging on. It had been 6 weeks since Jody arrived at Mount Valley. The November days were getting shorter, and the gray light filtering through the barred windows seemed particularly gloomy. Jody was gradually getting used to the prison routine, but every morning she woke up hoping that it was all just a nightmare and that she would soon be home with Michael. On Saturday morning, she had her first visit with her son. His grandmother brought Michael by bus from Akron. The trip took 3 hours each way. When Jody saw her boy in the visiting room, her heart nearly broke. Michael had lost weight. His once chubby cheeks were gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Mommy!" he cried, rushing toward her. Jody hugged her son so tightly that she was afraid she would hurt him, but she couldn't let go. "How's the treatment going, sweetheart?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The doctor says I'm getting better," Michael replied, but there was no childish joy in his voice. "Grandma reads to me every day. When are you coming home?" That question tormented Jody every night. "Soon, sweetie. Mommy has to fix her mistakes, but I'll be back." The hour flew by. When the guards announced that it was time to go, Michael cried, clinging to his mother's orange uniform. Jody struggled to hold back her tears as she said goodbye to her son until next Saturday. That evening, Carl Hamilton stayed in his office longer than usual. He was reviewing the weekly reports when he decided to walk around the blocks. Officially, it was called an unscheduled inspection, but in reality, Carl just didn't want to go home to the silence of his wife and the tense atmosphere. Block B was quiet. Most of the inmates had already gone to bed or were talking quietly in their cells. Carl was walking slowly down the corridor when he heard muffled sobs coming from cell 247. He stopped and saw Jody sitting on the edge of the bottom bunk, crying quietly. "Mitchell," he called softly. Jody jumped up, quickly wiping away her tears. "I'm sorry, sir. I wasn't breaking the silence. I know. Carl stared at her through the bars for a few seconds. "Did you have a visit today?" "Yes, sir." "Your son?" Jody nodded, not trusting her voice. "That's hard," Carl said more gently than usual. "Being away from a child is one of the hardest things there is." Something in his tone made Jody look up. "Do you have children, sir?" "Two, a boy and a girl." Carl paused. "How old is your son?" "6, he has leukemia." Carl felt a sudden pang of sympathy. He knew from Jody's file the reason for her crime, but only now did he truly understand the desperation that had led her to fraud. "You're doing a good job in the laundry," he said, changing the subject. "Miss Rodriguez has commented on your diligence." "Thank you, sir. It might be worth considering applying for a position in administration. The conditions are better, and the work is less physically demanding." Jody looked at him in surprise. Rita had warned her that transferring to a better job usually required months of waiting and impeccable behavior. "Think about it," Carl added and continued his rounds. Over the next few days, Jody noticed that her boss was showing up more often where she worked or hung out. At lunch, he might stop by her table to ask a neutral question about work or how she was feeling. In the laundry room, he would sometimes come in, pretending to check on things, but his eyes always found Jody among the other inmates. Rita was the first to notice the changes. "Listen, girl," she said one evening as they were getting ready for bed. "Hamilton's been hanging around you too much. It's not good." "What do you mean?" "He's a man with power, and you're a beautiful woman in a vulnerable position." Rita paused. "I've seen it before. Not in every prison, but it happens." Jody felt uncomfortable. "He's just being polite. Maybe he feels sorry for me and my son." "Maybe," Rita replied skeptically. "But be careful, very careful." A week later, Carl called Jody into his office. The warden's office was located on the second floor of the administrative wing and was strikingly different from the rest of Mount Valley. There were real windows without bars, bookshelves, leather chairs, and a large oak desk. "Sit down," Carl said, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. Jody sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She still didn't understand why she had been called in. "I spoke with Miss Rodriguez about your work. I also consulted with Dr. Reeder. All the feedback has been positive." Carl leaned back in his chair. "There is an opening for an assistant in the medical unit. The job includes record keeping, helping with medications, and general administrative duties." Jody couldn't hide her surprise. "Sir, I'm not a medic, but you have nursing training. Dr. Reeder thinks you'll pick it up quickly." That was true. Before she was married, Jody had worked as a nurse at the Akron hospital, but after Michael was born, she switched to part-time and then quit altogether to take care of her child. "The pay is better, and the conditions are better," Carl continued. "And importantly for you, there's a phone in the medical unit. Assistants are allowed one extra call a week for family reasons." An extra call to Michael. The chance to hear his voice, not just on Saturdays. Jody felt her heart beat faster. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked quietly. Carl was silent for a few seconds, staring out the window. "Everyone deserves a second chance, especially mothers." "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "I know you won't." As Jody left the office, she didn't notice how long Carl watched her go. Working in the medical unit proved to be a lifeline for Jody. Dr. Reeder was a patient mentor who explained procedures and gradually entrusted her with more responsibilities. The medical unit was a quiet place, far from the constant noise and tension of the main buildings. "You're a quick learner," Dr. Reeder said 2 weeks after her transfer. "I can tell you have experience." "I miss medicine," Jody admitted as she sorted through medical records. "It's one of the few things that makes me feel useful." Dr. Reeder nodded understandingly. He had seen many inmates who had lost their sense of self-worth and knew how important it was to find something that restored a sense of purpose. Carl began visiting the infirmary more often than his duties required. Officially, he was checking safety protocols, but in reality, his interest was focused on Jody. He watched her work, neatly, intently, with obvious care for each patient. "How's the new assistant?" he asked Dr. Reeder during one of his visits. "Excellent," the doctor replied. "Professional, reliable. The inmates trust her." Carl nodded. but his gaze followed Jody, who was taking the blood pressure of an elderly inmate. These visits did not go unnoticed. Little happened in the prison without witnesses, and soon rumors began to spread among the inmates. Some said Jody had a protector, others assumed the worst. Sergeant Rodriguez also noticed the change. Patricia was an experienced employee, and her instincts were rarely wrong. She had seen how Hamilton looked at Jody, and it bothered her. "Boss," she said one day, staying behind with Carl after the morning meeting. "Can we talk?" "Sure. About inmate Mitchell. Some staff members have noticed your special attention to her." Carl tensed. "What exactly do you mean, Sergeant?" "Frequent visits to the infirmary, transfer to a better job without the usual waiting period." Patricia chose her words carefully. People are starting to talk. "Mitchell is a model inmate with useful skills. She earned her promotion." "Yes, sir, but other people's perceptions are also important for maintaining order." Carl looked at Patricia coldly. "Sergeant, I appreciate your candor, but my administrative decisions do not require explanation. Mitchell got the job in the infirmary because she's qualified. Period." "Understood, sir." But Patricia left with an uneasy feeling. After years of working in the prison system, she knew all too well how power could corrupt even good people. Meanwhile, the relationship between Carl and Jody continued to develop. Their conversations became more and more personal. Carl talked about the difficulties of his job, about how hard it was to maintain order in an institution where every day could bring a new crisis. Jody listened attentively. She was a good listener by nature, and in prison, that quality became even more valuable. "Sometimes I feel like I'm responsible for everyone," Carl said during one of their conversations in the infirmary. "For the inmates, for the staff, for their families." "That's a heavy burden," Jody replied sincerely. "But it's clear that you care about people. That's rare." Carl looked at her gratefully. No one at home was interested in his work. Margaret saw his job as a necessary evil, a source of income that allowed them to maintain their lifestyle, but nothing more. In December, the weather turned bitterly cold, and the short days seemed endless. Jody received a letter from her mother with photos of Michael. The boy was smiling in the pictures, but Jody could see how he had changed in the months she had been away. He looked older than his age, and there was a sadness in his eyes that no 6-year-old should have. In the evening, as she sat in her cell rereading the letter for the 100th time, a guard approached the bars. "Mitchell, to the warden!" Rita glanced at her with concern but said nothing. Only a desk lamp was lit in Carl's office, creating an intimate atmosphere. Carl stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered courtyard. "Sit down," he said without turning around. Jody sat down in the familiar chair and waited. "Did you get the letter from your mother?" Carl asked, finally turning to her. "Yes, sir. How did you know?" "I read all incoming correspondence. It's protocol." He paused. "Your son looks better in the latest photos." Jody was surprised. She hadn't expected the warden to study her personal correspondence so closely. "The treatment is helping," she replied. "The doctors say there's been positive progress." "That's good." Carl moved closer and sat down on the edge of the table next to her chair. "Jody, can I call you by your first name? When we're alone?" Something in his tone made her wary. "Of course, sir. And you can call me Carl. Here in my office, we're just two people who understand each other." Jody wasn't sure she understood where he was going with this, but she nodded. "You know, I'm married," Carl continued. "But my marriage has long been a mere formality. My wife and I live as roommates." Jody felt a growing unease. This conversation was taking a dangerous turn. "Sir Carl, perhaps I should return to the unit." "Wait." He reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "I don't want to hurt you. I just haven't met anyone I could really talk to in a long time." There was no aggression in his touch, but Jody understood the ambiguity of the situation. She was a prisoner, he was the warden. Any relationship between them would be unequal by definition. "I have to go," she said, standing up. Carl didn't try to stop her, but his gaze told her that the conversation wasn't over. The winter of 2025 was particularly harsh in Ohio. Snow lay thick in the courtyard of Mount Valley, and the wind howled through the ventilation pipes, creating an ominous melody that haunted the prisoners even in their sleep. Jody had already spent 4 months in prison, and with each passing day, her relationship with Carl became more complicated and dangerous. After that evening conversation in his office, their meetings became regular. Carl found various excuses, discussing work in the infirmary, asking about the health of the prisoners, consulting on ways to improve medical care. But each time, their conversations became more intimate. Jody knew what she was doing was wrong, but she felt trapped. On the one hand, Carl was the only person in prison who treated her like a person, not a number. On the other hand, he controlled every aspect of her life, from her work to her visits with her son. In February, something happened that changed everything. Jody was late for work in the infirmary, which was completely out of character for her. Dr. Reeder became concerned and went to her cell. "Jody, what's wrong?" he asked, seeing her pale face. "I feel sick," she replied in a weak voice. "Nausea, dizziness." Dr. Reeder was an experienced doctor and immediately suspected something was wrong. "When did this start?" "A few days ago. I thought it was just the flu." "Let's go to the infirmary. We need to take a look at you." An hour later, Dr. Reeder knew something that would change many people's lives. The pregnancy test was positive. Jody was approximately 8 weeks pregnant. "That's impossible," Jody whispered, staring at the test result. "I'm not." Dr. Reeder was silent. He had been a doctor in the prison system long enough to understand all the possible scenarios, and what he suspected was extremely disturbing. "Jody," he said gently, "I need to ask you some questions, and I want you to know that everything you say will remain between us unless you decide otherwise." Jody stared at him with wide eyes, still unable to believe what was happening. "Did you have a close relationship with anyone in prison?" A long silence hung in the air. Finally, Jody nodded, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "With whom?" the doctor asked, though he already guessed from her reaction. "With Mr. Hamilton," she whispered. Dr. Reeder felt the blood drain from his face. This was the answer he had been dreading. A relationship between a prison warden and an inmate was not just unethical, it was criminal. Regardless of whether Jody considered it consensual, the law was clear. An inmate could not consent to intimacy with a member of the prison staff. "Jody, this is very serious," he said. "Do you understand the consequences?" "I didn't want it to just happen." She was crying now, sobbing. "He was so kind to me, cared for me, and I'm so lonely here. I miss Michael so much." Dr. Reeder handed her some tissues and sat down next to her. "Tell me how it started." Jody told him everything, about the evening meetings in his office, how Carl had gradually become closer to her, how their relationship had developed into physical intimacy a month ago. She talked about her feelings of guilt, about knowing that what was happening was wrong, but that she couldn't stop. "He said he loved me," she said through her tears, "that his marriage had been dead for years, that he'd never felt anything like this before, and I believed him." Dr. Reeder listened with growing anger. Not at Jody, she was the victim in this situation. His anger was directed at Carl Hamilton, who had abused his position in the most despicable way. "What should I do?" Jody asked. "What will happen to the baby? What will happen to me?" "First, we need to decide what to do with this information," the doctor replied. "By law, I am required to report a possible crime, but I want you to understand all of your options." They talked for over an hour. The doctor explained Jody's rights and the possible consequences for Carl and for her. He also explained the medical aspects of pregnancy in prison. In the end, they decided to wait a few days while Jody considered her options. Dr. Reeder gave her prenatal vitamins and asked her to come in for regular checkups. "And Jody," he said as he left, "be careful with Hamilton. Don't be alone with him until we decide what to do." But it was impossible to avoid Carl. The next day, he showed up at the infirmary under the pretext of checking new security protocols. "Jody, are you all right?" he asked, noticing her pallor. "Dr. Reeder said you weren't feeling well." "I'm fine," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Just a little under the weather." Carl moved closer, and Jody caught the familiar scent of his cologne. "Maybe we should move you to something lighter. I don't want you overexerting yourself." No thank you. I like working here. Something in her tone alarmed Carl. Jody was usually more responsive, more open with him. See you tonight? I need to discuss a few things with you. Jody knew that these things were just an excuse for their intimate encounters. I'm tired, Mr. Hamilton. Maybe another time? Carl frowned. Jody had never turned him down before. Jody, what's going on? I feel like you're avoiding me. Nothing's going on. I just need some rest. But Carl didn't believe her. He knew Jody well enough to know when she was hiding something. That evening, Dr. Reeder stayed late at the infirmary, mulling over the situation. He was in an impossible position. On the one hand, he was obligated to report a crime. On the other hand, he understood that it would ruin Jody's life and possibly put her safety at risk. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Carl Hamilton entered the infirmary. Doctor, sorry to bother you so late. I wanted to discuss the health of one of the inmates. Which one? Asked the doctor, although he already knew the answer. Jody Mitchell. She looked unwell today. Perhaps she needs further examination. Dr. Reeder looked at Carl intently. Her condition is stable, nothing serious. Are you sure? She looked very pale to me. Mr. Hamilton, the doctor said slowly, may I ask why you are so concerned about the health of this particular inmate? Carl tensed. I am concerned about the health of all the inmates. It's my job. Of course. But Mitchell seems to be of particular concern to you. A tense silence hung in the air. The two men looked at each other, each knowing that the other knew more than he was saying. Doctor, Carl said finally, I hope we have mutual respect and understand the importance of discretion in certain matters. I understand the importance of following the law and medical ethics, Dr. Reeder replied. Carl nodded, but his eyes grew cold. Good. Then we understand each other. After Carl left, Dr. Reeder realized that the situation was becoming even more dangerous. Carl suspected that their secret had been revealed, and that made him unpredictable. The next few weeks passed in tense anticipation. Jody continued to work in the infirmary, but avoided prolonged contact with Carl. Dr. Reeder monitored her condition and saw the toxemia gradually recede and the pregnancy become more noticeable. In March, an event occurred that forced everyone to make decisions. During a routine medical checkup, one of the inmates noticed a change in Jody's figure and loudly asked if she was pregnant. Rumors spread through the prison like wildfire. By evening, everyone knew, inmates and staff alike. Sergeant Rodriguez came to Dr. Reeder with a direct question. Doctor, is Mitchell really pregnant? The doctor knew he couldn't hide the truth any longer. Yes. How far along is she? About 14 weeks. Patricia quickly did the math. So she got pregnant while she was here? Yes. Who's the father? Dr. Reeder paused. I think you should talk to Jody herself. But Patricia already knew the answer. Too many details were coming together to form a clear picture. Hamilton's special attention to Jody, her transfer to a better job, the frequent calls to the boss's office. That evening, Carl called Jody into his office. When she entered, his face was grim. Sit down, he said sharply. Jody sat down, feeling her heart pound in her chest. There are rumors going around the prison that you're pregnant, Carl began. Is that true? Jody nodded, not trusting her voice. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know how. Carl stood up and began pacing around the office. Do you understand what this means for both of us? Yes. No, you don't, he exploded. If this gets out, my career is over. My marriage is ruined. My children will be disgraced. Jody looked at him with growing horror. This wasn't the man who had told her he loved her. This was a frightened man who only cared about himself. What about me? She asked quietly. What about the baby? Carl stopped and looked at her. We have to fix this. What do you mean? Terminate the pregnancy. Say it was an accident, a miscarriage from the stress of prison life. Jody shook her head. I won't do that. Jody, be reasonable. Think about your son. If this story becomes public, it will ruin his life too. Don't you dare mention my son, Jody shouted, raising her voice at Carl for the first time. You only think about yourself. Carl approached her, his eyes threatening. Listen to me carefully, Jody. I have the power to make your life here unbearable. I can send you to solitary confinement. cancel all visits with your son, transfer you to a cell with the most dangerous inmates." Jody looked at him in horror, finally seeing his true colors. "But if you're reasonable," he continued in a softer tone, "we can settle this quietly. No one will ever know." "What if I tell the truth?" Jody asked, her voice trembling. Carl smiled coldly. "Who would believe a prisoner against a prison warden with an impeccable reputation? What's more, who would believe that you didn't seduce me for better conditions?" Jody realized she was trapped. Carl held all the cards, and she was defenseless. 4 months later, in July 2025, Jody gave birth to a daughter in the prison infirmary. The delivery was difficult. Jody's blood pressure rose, and Dr. Reeder feared for the lives of both mother and child. But in the end, a healthy baby girl weighing 3 kilograms was born. Jody named her daughter Hope. Carl was not present at the birth, but he came to the infirmary the next day. He looked at the baby through the glass partition of the incubator, his face unreadable. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. Jody lay in her hospital bed, pale and exhausted. "What happens now?" "The baby will be taken to a children's home in a few days. Standard procedure." "No!" Jody tried to sit up, but her weakness prevented her. "She can live with my mother, with Michael." "I'll see what I can do," Carl said, but there was no conviction in his voice. In the days that followed, Jody began to change. The birth of her daughter awakened her maternal instincts, and at the same time, her anger toward Carl for abandoning them both. She realized she could no longer remain silent. "I'm going to tell everyone the truth," she told Carl during one of his visits. "About us, about how you abused your power." Carl turned pale. "Jody, you don't understand the consequences. I understand better than you think. My daughter will be taken away from me and put in a children's home because of your selfishness. My son is growing up without a mother, and you continue to live your life as if nothing happened. If you talk, I'll make sure you never see your children again," Carl threatened. But Jody was no longer afraid of his threats. Motherhood had given her a strength she had never known before. "Try it," she said, "but the truth will come out anyway." Carl left the infirmary with a grim face. For the first time in their relationship, he felt he was losing control of the situation. That night, he sat in his office for a long time, considering his options. Jody had become a threat to everything he had built, and threats had to be eliminated. August brought stifling heat to Mount Valley. The air conditioners in the prison were malfunctioning, and the corridors were filled with heavy air saturated with sweat and tension. 2 weeks had passed since Hope's birth, and the atmosphere in the institution was becoming increasingly tense. David the Bull Thompson was one of the guards Carl Hamilton could rely on in any situation. A 29-year-old man with a powerful build and a dull gaze, he had worked at Mount Valley for 3 years and never asked unnecessary questions. His nickname, Buck, accurately reflected both his physical attributes and his intellectual abilities. Thompson was known for his cruelty toward inmates. Several complaints had been filed against him for abuse of authority, but Carl always covered up these incidents. David was useful precisely because of his willingness to cross the line that other guards would not cross. Thompson had problems in his personal life. He owed a large sum of money to local bookmakers, and his addiction to gambling only got worse. Carl knew about these weaknesses and skillfully exploited them. On the evening of August 15th, Carl called Thompson into his office. It was 10:30, the shift was ending, and almost no one was left in the administrative building. "David, sit down," Carl said, pointing to the chair across from his desk. Thompson sat down, his massive body barely fitting into the chair. "Something happened, boss?" "We have a problem," Carl began, pouring himself a whiskey from a bottle he kept in his desk. "A serious problem that could destroy our entire operation here." "What kind of problem?" Carl took a sip and looked intently at Thompson. "Prisoner Mitchell. She knows something that could bury us all." Thompson frowned. He knew there was something going on between his boss and this prisoner, but he wasn't interested in the details. "And what do you want me to do?" "She's threatening to tell everything. She says she'll go to the prosecutor, to the press." Carl took another sip. "That can't be allowed to happen. Maybe transfer her to solitary?" Restrict her contact? Not enough. She could talk at any moment. We need a more permanent solution. There was a pause. Thompson slowly realized where the conversation was going. Boss, are you talking about... I'm talking about the need to protect myself, my family, my career, Carl interrupted. And protect you at the same time. Because if I go down, you go down with me. All those incidents I covered up. The threat hung in the air. Thompson knew he had no choice. What exactly do you want? Carl opened the desk drawer and took out an envelope. Here's $15,000 in cash. That'll be enough to pay off your debts and start a new life. Thompson took the envelope with trembling hands. The money could solve all his problems. It has to look like suicide, Carl continued. A young mother desperate to be with her children. In her position, it will look plausible. How? Hanging in her cell, twisted sheets. Classic Carl took a diagram of Block B out of the safe. Tomorrow night, during the 2 to 6 shift, you'll be on duty alone in that wing. The surveillance cameras in that section of the corridor broke down yesterday. A remarkable coincidence. Thompson studied the diagram. What if she resists? Put her to sleep first. You have access to the meds. Carl handed him a key. This is for the medical kit in the infirmary. Take something strong. What about camera 246? Her neighbor Moreno is there. Rita will be in solitary tomorrow, a minor violation that I'll discover in the afternoon. Carl had thought everything through. Thompson understood that he was dealing with a professional who left nothing to chance. After it's all over, call the medics in half an hour. Say you found the body during your rounds. Shock, panic, everything as it should be. Thompson nodded, even though his stomach was churning with self-loathing. And then you submit a letter of resignation for family reasons. You move to another state. You start a new life with a clean slate. The next day, Jody sensed that something had changed. The atmosphere in the prison became even more tense. The guards avoided looking her in the eye, and Rita Moreno was punished for allegedly violating the rules and was transferred to solitary confinement for 3 days. It's strange, Jody said to Dr. Reeder during her next examination. Rita never breaks the rules. Dr. Reeder also noticed unusual activity among the administration. Carl Hamilton looked tense, and some of the guards were acting nervous. Jody, he said quietly, are you still thinking about telling the truth? Yes. I can't keep quiet any longer. My children deserve better. Be careful. Very careful. Hamilton is a dangerous man when he's cornered. That evening, Jody went to bed in an empty cell. Rita's absence made the room even more gloomy and lonely. She thought about Hope, who was lying in the infirmary, and about Michael, who didn't even know his sister existed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Thompson began his shift. He was alone in Block B, which was unusual, but explained by the lack of staff. In his pocket was a syringe containing a strong sedative that he had taken from the infirmary. Thompson walked slowly down the corridor, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. Most of the inmates were asleep, with only the occasional muffled conversation or cough to be heard. When he reached cell 247, his heart began to beat faster. Jody was lying on the lower bunk, turned toward the wall. Thompson quietly unlocked the door and entered the cell. Jody woke up at the sound of the door creaking. "Who's there?" she asked in a sleepy voice. "Be quiet," Thompson whispered. "Don't scream." Jody sat up on her bunk, trying to make out the guard's figure in the darkness. "What do you want?" Thompson approached her. He was holding a syringe in his hand. "This won't take long." Jody realized the danger and tried to scream, but Thompson quickly covered her mouth with his hand. She struggled desperately, scratching his hands, but the guard's physical superiority was overwhelming. The injection hit her neck. The drug took effect quickly. Within seconds, Jody lost consciousness. Thompson was breathing heavily from the strain and fear. Now came the hardest part. He pulled the sheets off the cot and began twisting them into a makeshift rope. His hands were shaking, and he had to redo the knot several times. When the rope was ready, he lifted the unconscious Jody and secured one end of the sheet to the metal grate of the ventilation shaft. He tied the other end around her neck. Then Thompson carefully placed the stool under Jody's feet and let go of her body. The stool fell with a crash that seemed deafening in the silence of the night. Jody hung motionless. Thompson checked her pulse. It was gone. The deed was done. The guard put away the syringe and looked around the cell, making sure he hadn't left any traces. Then he quietly left and locked the door. The next half hour was the longest of his life. Thompson paced the hallway, trying to look normal, but inside he was consumed by horror and self-loathing. At 2:30, he returned to cell 247 and turned on the light. "Oh my God!" he cried, feigning shock. "Help! Medical attention!" The alarm woke all the inmates in the block. Chaos ensued, screams, cries, the sound of running feet. Within minutes, medics and prison officials arrived. Dr. Reeder was one of the first to arrive at the scene. When he saw Jody's body, his heart almost stopped. He knew it wasn't suicide, but he couldn't say anything yet. Carl Hamilton appeared 10 minutes later, looking alarmed and upset. "What happened?" he asked. "Inmate Mitchell committed suicide," Thompson reported in a trembling voice. "I found her during my rounds." Carl approached the body and shook his head with an expression of deep sorrow. Poor girl. Apparently being separated from her children was too much for her. Dr. Reeder examined the body carefully. Something about Jody's posture and the nature of her neck injuries seemed suspicious to him, but he said nothing for the moment. "We need to call the police," he said. "Of course," Carl agreed. "Standard procedure when an inmate dies." An hour later, Detective Lisa Carter of the Franklin County Police Department arrived at Mount Valley. A sharp-minded 38-year-old woman with a reputation as a principled investigator, she specialized in complex cases. Carter began by examining the scene. The cell was small and cramped, with a metal bunk bed, a small table, and a metal toilet with a sink. The body was still hanging from a makeshift rope made of bed sheets. "Who found the body?" she asked. "Guard Thompson," Carl replied. "David, tell the detective what happened." Thompson repeated his version, trying to sound convincing. "I was doing my usual rounds. I noticed that the light was on in the cell, even though it should have been off. I looked inside and saw this." "What time was that?" Carter asked. "Around 2:30. Carter examined the rope, the knots, the position of the body. Something about the scene seemed wrong to her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "Did the inmate have any reasons to commit suicide?" she asked Carl. "Unfortunately, yes. Mitchell recently gave birth to a baby who had to be taken to an orphanage. She also has a 6-year-old son who lives with his grandmother. Being separated from her children had a profound effect on her." "Did she give birth here in prison?" "Yes, she got pregnant before she was arrested." Carl lied without hesitation. Dr. Reeder stood nearby and listened to the lie, feeling his anger grow, but he knew he had to remain silent for now. "I need to talk to the doctor," Carter said. "Of course, Dr. Reeder has been monitoring her condition." Carter took the doctor aside. "What was the prisoner's mental state?" The doctor chose his words carefully. "She was worried about her children, but I didn't consider her suicidal. Did she say anything about wanting to hurt herself?" "No. On the contrary, she planned to fight for her children after her release." Carter noticed a hesitation in the doctor's voice. "Is there anything else I should know?" Dr. Reeder glanced at Carl, who was watching their conversation. "Possibly, but not here." "Okay, we'll talk later at the station." Carter continued her examination of the scene. She photographed the camera from different angles, collected fiber samples from the rope, and checked the condition of the lock on the door. "Are the surveillance cameras in this area working?" she asked. "Unfortunately, no," Carl replied. "The system went down yesterday. We're waiting for a repairman." Another convenient coincidence, Carter thought. Her experience told her that too many coincidences usually meant that they weren't coincidences at all. "I need a list of everyone who had access to this unit tonight." "Only Thompson. We're short-staffed on the night shift." Carter noted the information. One guard for an entire block. Another oddity. Once the body had been removed, Carter spoke to several inmates in neighboring cells. Most of them had been asleep and hadn't heard anything until Thompson's scream. But one woman, Maria Santos, said something interesting. "I heard some noise around 2 in the morning," she said, "like someone was walking down the hall. Then there was a thud, like something fell. Did you see who it was? No, but the footsteps were heavy, a man's. Carter wrote down the statement and mentally noted the discrepancy. If Thompson found the body at 2:30, what happened at 2? By morning, the preliminary investigation was complete. The official version was suicide, but Detective Carter had serious doubts. As she was leaving Mount Valley, Dr. Reeder approached her car. "Detective, I need to talk to you, but not here." "Sure. Come to the station in an hour." The doctor nodded and looked back at the prison. He knew he was making a dangerous decision, but he couldn't keep quiet any longer. Jody Mitchell deserved justice. The Franklin County Police Department was relatively quiet at noon. Detective Lisa Carter was sitting in her office reviewing photos from the Mount Valley crime scene when her secretary announced that Dr. Reeder had arrived. James Reeder entered the office looking exhausted and nervous. He had spent the last few hours in agonizing deliberation, weighing the consequences of what he was about to say. "Doctor, have a seat," Carter offered. "What exactly did you want to tell me about Jody Mitchell?" Ryder took a deep breath. "Detective, what I'm about to tell you will completely change your understanding of this case. I'm listening." Jody Mitchell did not commit suicide. In fact, someone had very good reasons to want her dead. Carter sat up straight in her chair. "Explain." The doctor told the whole story about Jody's pregnancy, who the father was, Carl Hamilton's threats, and Jody's decision to tell the truth. Carter listened without interrupting, but her face grew increasingly serious. "Do you have any evidence of this connection?" she asked when the doctor finished. "Medical records of the pregnancy and birth. A DNA test on the child can confirm paternity. I also kept informal records of our conversations with Jody. Why didn't you report this earlier?" The doctor lowered his head. "I was afraid. Hamilton is a powerful man, and Jody asked me to give her time to decide what to do." Carter understood the complexity of the situation. Accusations against the warden required irrefutable evidence. Who else knew about this relationship? Sergeant Rodriguez suspected something. Some of the guards may have seen something or had their suspicions. "What about guard Thompson?" The doctor paused. "Thompson is close to Hamilton. If anyone could have done such a dirty job, it would be him." Carter wrote down every word. "What exactly did you find suspicious about Jody's death?" "The nature of the injuries to her neck are not consistent with suicide. Besides, Jody was determined to fight for her children. She was planning to go to the district attorney next week." After the doctor left, Carter immediately contacted the district attorney's office. The case required immediate intervention from higher authorities. Meanwhile, in Mount Valley, Carl Hamilton thought the worst was behind him. Thompson had handed in his resignation and was planning to leave for California the following week. The official suicide story had been accepted, and it seemed that the mystery had been buried with Jody. But in the afternoon, the situation changed dramatically. A team of investigators from the state prosecutor's office, led by Prosecutor David McRae, arrived at the prison. "Mr. Hamilton," McRae said as he entered the warden's office, "we have reason to believe that the death of inmate Mitchell occurred under suspicious circumstances." Carl tried to remain calm. "I don't understand what you're talking about. It was suicide." "We have information about your relationship with the deceased, an intimate relationship." Carl's heart began to race, but he continued to deny it. "That's absurd. Who would say such a thing? Several sources confirm this information. We have also obtained a warrant to seize medical records and conduct a DNA test on the child." Carl realized that the walls were closing in on him. "I demand a lawyer." "That is your right, but for now, you are suspended from duty pending the completion of the investigation." That same day, Thompson was arrested at Columbus Airport as he attempted to fly to Los Angeles. A search revealed $15,000 in cash on his person, the exact amount Carl had given him for the murder. Thompson's interrogation began immediately. At first, he denied all charges, but when he was shown the bank records and told about the possible punishment for first-degree murder, his resolve wavered. "Listen," Thompson's lawyer said, "my client is willing to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence." Prosecutor McRae nodded. "We're willing to consider that option if the information is useful." Thompson told them everything about his debts, how Carl recruited him, and the detailed planning of the murder. He also handed over the used syringe, which he had kept in his apartment as insurance. Hamilton said that if anything went wrong, he would pin it all on me, Thompson confessed. That's why I kept the evidence. An examination of the syringe revealed traces of a sedative in Thompson's fingerprints. In addition, microscopic particles of blood were found on the syringe, which later turned out to be Jody's blood. A second autopsy on Jody's body confirmed Dr. Reeder's suspicions. Traces of a strong sedative were found in her blood, and the nature of the injuries to her neck indicated that she was already unconscious at the time of the hanging. This is definitely murder, concluded the medical examiner. The victim was sedated and then hanged while unconscious. A DNA test confirmed that Carl Hamilton was the father of Jody's daughter. This finally debunked his claim that he had never had an intimate relationship with the prisoner. Carl was arrested on the third day of the investigation. When detectives arrived at his home, his wife Margaret was in shock. "Is it true?" she asked as Carl was being handcuffed. "Is it what they're saying on the news?" Carl didn't answer, but his silence spoke louder than any words. The Hamilton children, 16-year-old Brad and 14-year-old Emily, watched their father's arrest from the window. Their world was shattered in an instant. Sergeant Patricia Rodriguez was appointed acting chief of Mount Valley. She immediately launched an internal investigation to find out who else on the staff might be involved in corruption. "I'm ashamed of what was happening right under our noses," she told Detective Carter. "I suspected something was wrong, but I didn't think it would go this far." "You couldn't have known about the murder plans," Carter replied. "The important thing is that the truth came out." The trial of Carl Hamilton and David Thompson began 6 months later. It attracted widespread media attention as an example of corruption in the prison system and abuse of power. Thompson, who agreed to a plea bargain with the prosecution, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for second-degree murder. His testimony against Carl was key to the prosecution's case. Carl Hamilton was found guilty of first-degree murder, rape of an inmate, since inmates cannot consent to sexual relations with a representative of the administration, corruption, and abuse of office. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, Carl showed emotion for the first time. "I never wanted Jody to die," he said. "I just panicked." The judge looked at him coldly. "You used your power to coerce a vulnerable woman into intimacy and then ordered her murder to cover up your crimes. This is one of the most disgusting cases I have ever had to consider." After the trial, Jody's mother, Barbara Mitchell, was granted custody of her granddaughter Hope. The girl grew up with Michael, who by then was successfully undergoing treatment for leukemia. Dr. Reeder left his job in the prison system and opened a private practice. The guilt of not being able to protect Jody haunted him for a long time. "I should have been more decisive," he told reporters. "Maybe she would be alive today." Sergeant Rodriguez carried out a major reform in Mount Valley, tightening security protocols and creating an independent complaint system for inmates. The Jody Mitchell case was a catalyst for reforms throughout the Ohio prison system. Rules governing staff interactions with inmates were tightened, mandatory psychological evaluations for employees were introduced, and an independent commission was created to investigate complaints. Detective Carter was promoted and became head of a new department investigating crimes in correctional facilities. The Mitchell case showed that even in the most controlled environments, horrific abuses can occur, she said in an interview. "Our job is to make sure that never happens again." 10 years later, Michael Mitchell, now a healthy 16-year-old teenager, visited his mother's grave with 11-year-old Hope. The girl grew up knowing the truth about her origins, but also knowing that her mother was a hero who fought for justice. "Mom fought for us until the end," Michael told his sister as he placed flowers on the grave. "She wanted us to know the truth." Hope nodded, though it was difficult for her to understand the full complexity of the story. Was she brave? Very brave. Barbara Mitchell, now a woman in her 70s, watched her grandchildren from a distance. She had done everything she could to give the children a normal life, despite the tragic circumstances of their birth. Jody Mitchell's story was a reminder that justice sometimes comes late, but it comes. Her death was not in vain. It led to changes that protected thousands of other prisoners from similar abuses. In a prison cell in Ohio's maximum security prison, Carl Hamilton spent his days reflecting on how one wrong decision had destroyed so many lives. He lost his family, his career, his freedom, all for a moment of power over a defenseless woman. Thompson was serving his sentence in another prison, where his reputation as a former security guard made life particularly difficult. He often thought about the moment he agreed to kill someone for money and regretted his choice. But the greatest tragedy was the death of Jody, a young mother who was simply trying to get treatment for her sick son and ended up becoming a victim of the system that was supposed to protect her. Her story is a lesson that power without control always leads to abuse, and silence in the face of injustice makes everyone complicit in the crime.